This is episode 32 of the Women in Depth podcast. The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Women in Depth. Today we're going to be talking about an area that is very compelling and fascinating, and this is the area of sexuality and spirituality. Tamara Powell will be our guide as we explore why sexuality and spirituality are so difficult for many to reconcile, much less talk about. We'll explore the relationship between sexuality and spirituality, and Tamara will share how she supports those who are struggling with the intersection between sex and faith. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, our guest is Tamara Powell. Tamara has been on the podcast several times, and I'm so excited to have her back again. Tamara is a licensed mental health counselor and empowerment coach specializing in identity work, particularly issues related to sexuality and spirituality. She opened ARIA Therapy Services in 2014 in Pensacola, Florida, with a mission of bringing holistic and diversity-affirming therapeutic services to the Bible Belt. Since then, Tamara has expanded ARIA into a group practice and personally works with clients all over the world online. More recently, Tamara created a tribe she calls Tales from a Trapezoid, dedicated to the more raw, intimate, and edgy side of being a trapezoid in a world full of circles. Hi, Tamara, and welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Lourdes. I'm excited to be here.
I know that you've been on the podcast a few times now, and some of our listeners are familiar with you, but for maybe those who are new to Women in Depth, could you share a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. I'm in my late 30s. I have two daughters who are currently 13 and 11. And like you said, I've been in private practice, now group practice for several years, recently expanded to doing online counseling and coaching, and that's been absolutely amazing. And my favorite subjects are anything that has to do with spirituality or sexuality. Anything. So, however those end up intersecting. So this topic today is exciting.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about it also because I think that, sex and God are two very emotionally charged areas,
right,
in our lives. Yeah. And so I know that this is an area that you have studied, been very interested in, and maybe a good starting point is to just share why you were so drawn to these areas.
Well, I think you hit on something huge there, that they are both very emotionally charged subjects. And as an emotional creature myself, I think I picked up on that really young, probably younger than other people like to talk about. I think I was already getting an idea not only of spirituality, because I was raised in a conservative form of Christianity, but also of sexuality. I don't know how that got sparked into my awareness, but I mean, if you think about it, that's totally root, sacral chakra, and crown chakra at the same time. So when I look at man, I think by nature, we are a spiritual creature, and we've also likely been having sex since day one or two. I can't imagine any human, especially early on, not wanting to get off that first day. So to me, there's been, you can't separate the two. And so how we think about things in life spiritually affects our sexuality and vice versa. If I'm about to have sex with someone and it is in any way against my spiritual worldview, even if you're agnostic or atheist, I'm going to have an issue with it. So how did you begin to, I guess, to learn more about these areas or study these areas? What was that process for you from this realization of, wow, these areas of sexuality and spirituality really have called my attention? Sure.
Where did you go from there?
Well, I think actually starting in my teen years, I was already picking up on the fact that in my own denominations and those in Christianity as a whole, I couldn't understand, number one, why we weren't talking about it more. Number two, why it seemed so prohibitive at times. Number three, why there appeared to be so much dysfunction. And now I know statistically that sometimes there's actually more dysfunction, just statistical norm for norm in groupings within religious denominations than those goes without. And so I started with my own sacred texts first. I've read the Bible more times than I can count, and as many different translations probably as are out there. And then in college, I'm a non-traditional student, so I did a couple years, and then I took time off to get married and have babies, and raised them till they went to school, and then I went back. So I started picking up on the fact that I love psychology when I first went back, but then every single class that I took in psychology, it was always mating behaviors that jumped off the page at me. And so I like to think that everyone has their favorite puzzle, and for me, sex is it. Like, I want to know why someone's attracted to so-and-so and not someone else. Why can one couple engage in pornography and there's no issue when someone else will get addicted? Why is there sexual dysfunction in this 40-year-old man but not in another one? So for me, I just took every single class. Didn't matter what it was, statistics or psychopathology. I was going to be studying sex and religion related to it. So I don't know if that quite answered your question.
Yeah, it does. And, I think that, what you were saying, that this is just not an area that people really talk about, that the questions you're asking that you just mentioned right now off the top of your head, I'm sure everyone has questions like that, right?
That's been my experience, yes.
Yeah.
Both clinically and personally, right. And it's so taboo, and sometimes that adds to it. It's just bizarre to me.
Yeah. And as you did your own research and you're reading these sacred texts, and, you mentioned some statistics, what were the things that kind of jumped out at you? That
for the people who had a way of navigating their spiritual worldview and their sexual identity, they thrived, and both seemed to fuel the other. It's kind of like that crown chakra and that root chakra suddenly become engaged, and there's like a wonderful, kind of like a copper pipe conduit running between the two, and everything flows, and it's beautiful. And ironically, the sexuality adds to the spirituality, and the spirituality adds to the sexuality. But for those clients who either could not wrap their brain around their own sacred text, or who had sexual trauma and had no container to put it in, that one or the other ends of the polarity actually worsened each other. Like, there was a confounding effect. That was the first thing that I picked up on.
Okay, so basically, I'll make sure I'm getting this right. For those who were able to honor their sexuality and their spirituality, that just strengthened it, and that connection became more vibrant and more alive. If it was disconnected, one or both sides really began to actually kind of atrophy.
Absolutely. And make all of our levels of being go off, right? So it doesn't matter what your worldview is. Even from an atheistic neuroscience point of view, we do believe that man is both mind, body, and either will, drive, spirit, soul, you name it. And so if all three of those, or however many levels you want to dissect this out, are not playing well together, you're going to see symptoms of distress and dysfunction pop up.
So I'm going to pause a little bit before we continue, because this is so fascinating. But I'm thinking that maybe there are some listeners who are not clear on what you may mean by spirituality, and they might be wondering, well, I belong to a religion. So maybe if we can
dissect
that, and then a couple more things. So go ahead.
So when we're talking about spirituality, I think it's important to explain the verbiage surrounding that, and it really can vary person to person. When I use that phrase, I mean a way of connecting with anything outside oneself. So some people happen to use a quote-unquote traditional religion, Catholicism, Christianity, Islam, you name it, as a way of connecting with their version of the divine. For others, even if they are atheistic, agnostic, they don't know what's out there, they still have experiences of feeling connection, perhaps to nature, to another human being, to art, music, something that takes them outside themselves, that they can get lost in the flow of. That's kind of what I mean by spirituality. And so for individuals who have a way of integrating both their thoughts, their emotions, and their physical bodies, and a sense of something outside themselves, both sex and spirituality seem to really thrive. If we can't, because one thing is a little bit off, what I've noticed as a counselor is that it affects all of the other levels as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, going back to what you were describing as far as this, our sexuality and its connection to our spirituality, maybe if you could provide some examples of how this disconnect, how you've seen it show up, maybe in examples of, client situations, or to kind of take the ideas and make it more concrete for our listeners.
Absolutely. I think a good place to start with that is one of my favorite female woman crushes, Dr. Charlotte Casal, I think is how you pronounce her name. She's a psychotherapist, and she authored the If the Buddha series. So If the Buddha dated, if the Buddha married, that type of thing. And she talks about how sexual energy is so powerful. And I mean, we know that. Psychotherapists have been talking about this since before Freud's time about it. There's an instinct and a drive. And so it can either draw us together or it tears us apart. And she says it can soothe us or wound us, right? We can either feel objectified like a piece of meat, or we can enter into a state of flow with our partners, this giving and receiving that really, even in Christian terms, there's that merging of like one flesh, that experience of oneness. And so what I have seen in my clients is that if their spiritual worldview is not in alignment with perhaps how they identify sexually or what they feel like they want sexually, there's a schism both internally, and then that affects all of their relationships around them, and conversely comes back to cause a problem with their relationship with the divine. So for example, I've worked with a lot of Christian men who become addicted to pornography. I'm going to use the word addictive because it's their term, not mine. I think that's a whole nother podcast on what we can call sexual addictions. But that's not to me as a psychotherapist, if there's distress and dysfunction there, it should be treated. Who gives a fuck what we're labeling it, right? So addictions, they come in, and by their sheer feeling that they have a problem with pornography, it shuts them down sexually, and it shuts their prayer life down, their spiritual life down. And now we've got distress and dysfunction again at both ends of the pole. And if we're thinking long term as to life after death, according to their worldview, if they died in sin and there was not repentance, they really feel like that's going to affect their afterlife. Whereas conversely, when I see sexuality that is grounded in spirituality within that spiritual container, it allows people to have an ongoing exploration and a deepening of knowing, as Dr. Casal puts it, right? It allows them to feel like they are authentic to themselves and also with their partners. And so I have some clients who perhaps they are Christian, since we're on that thread right now, but who, when they come in to work with me, I've often seen, for example, a woman who's afraid to give her husband oral sex because a pastor told her that that was a homosexual act. But that's something that he really, really wants. And now she feels a deep sense of shame. So not only is she shut down sexually, but she's also shut down spiritually. I have a wife right now who's recently, I should say, who was Catholic, and husband is polyamorous. So one of her fears is she being caused to sin if she allows it? Because she herself isn't, but she might be willing to let him have a girlfriend.
Right.
So again, she's being shut down. It's affecting her relationship and her version of sexuality because she can no longer feel free to engage sexually if she feels like she's sinning. Those are just the ones off the top of my head.
So I can see how a lot of people can end up in a situation where there's a disconnect between their sexuality and spirituality, and both are now, I guess, in a way, operating in a really dysfunctional way. And it's difficult to find a way to move through that because they are trying to fit into either an institution or a society or a culture's, I guess, idea of how sexuality and or spirituality should look.
Right. Emphasis on should.
Yeah. So this is something that's actually very, you can see that has a lot of deep impact on many, many people.
Absolutely. And I think it affects all of us daily is my belief. We just may not be aware of it.
Well, I think part of it is because of that taboo aspect of sexuality, of not even wanting to talk about anything, so that the conversations never happen. And people are kind of left to try to grapple with this in isolation because of that sense of shame?
Absolutely. That reminds me of a quote by Margot Anand. She's a tantric, I don't think she's a psychotherapist, but she's a tantric educator.
Okay.
And she says that sex lies at the root of life. So that again reminds me of the root chakra. And it's crucial that we learn a reverence for it. Well, where else can we be better talking about reverence than in our temples and mosques and churches and, ashrams?
I wonder too, because, there's a lot of, there's a lot of opinion and ideas about, what sex is okay and what kind of sexual practices are not. Maybe if you can help our listeners get an idea of how is that determination really made for the individual of what, maybe this kind of goes to what you were saying earlier, that for some, pornography is something that enhances their sexual experience. And for others, it turns into something that is actually a shackle. So how does someone go about determining that the sexuality I'm involved in is honoring me and is, despite how maybe it can look on the outside, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a very, very dicey, tricky spot because it depends upon who you're giving that power to. And so I typically gently encourage clients that no matter what their spiritual worldview, to remember that their connection is between them and the divine, that other people may be included in our how, and they can help inform our how and why. But at the end of the day, no matter what you believe in, it's about you and God. So it comes down to definitions. And when I look across the main three, the Abrahamic religions, and also Buddhism, it's all about intentionality. It's all about respect and reverence. And it's all about it being individual to the partners at play. So in Buddhism, there's a very big emphasis on that which does not violate someone else's autonomy, that sex should not be used in a way that is invasive of another human being. There should not be any coercion. I mean, that it's pretty straightforward, right?
Right.
But in that case, pornography could come into play. Are you using porn as a way of distracting yourself, or is it truly a sexually empowering experience? If you are using it as a way of practicing attachment rather than non-attachment from that worldview, then pornography for you is a problem. It reminds me of the story in the Christian Bible about there was a division among the disciples about whether the new converts should be allowed to eat meat, because traditional Jews were not allowed to eat certain kinds of meat. And the Apostle Paul basically told them, I take it back. Might have been God. Either way, the bottom line of the story, I'm getting so excited trying to cross all my sacred texts here. My apologies to all the Christians listening. I do know my Bible. I'm just really excited. Bottom line of the story, however, is that it needed to be an individual decision. And in order to bring in the new converts, we should not be imposing restrictions that are not on their conscience, that should be up to the Holy Spirit to, prick their conscience if that's something that should not be done for them.
Yeah.
If you choose to give up meat, if you choose to only eat fish on Fridays, that's for you. If you choose not to give your husband oral sex, that's between you and God.
Yeah. So really, the reason that, I know this was a big question that I asked you, but I think, part of the reason why it's, a complex question to answer is that the answers are as unique as there are people, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's just very personal. And it reminds me of a quote that I think I shared with you the first podcast we did on spiritual abuse by Emerson, that, God / the divine / spirituality enters into the life of every person through a private door, which I think speaks to that individual experience with the divine.
Absolutely. And I think if you are attempting to use anyone else as your authority, it's important to remind yourself that these holy men in our lives, and a lot of them absolutely are. I think there's a time and a place for organized religion, and especially if it brings you closer to the divine, but you're still having several degrees of separation between you and God at that point. Like if this holy man is receiving God's word, it's also being translated through his lens to you. And it is important to take that in. But at the end of the day, you are the one who will stand before God, not him on your behalf. So
really putting the responsibility back on the individual to develop that relationship with God or the divine, or what that means to them.
Right. And I think with that reverence that Margot's talking about, that's the key that transforms sex from being just basic, egoic, lust-driven, and there's a time and place for it. That can be hot. Physical, getting off to the more of a spiritual transcendence. It's that reverence both for our spiritual container and for our partner and for ourselves. And that means that I have to show up in my authenticity and responsibility for what's about to take place.
I think, part of what also makes this such a challenging experience for all humans is that I think we have limited ideas and definitions of what sexuality and spirituality can look like. And so I think that also gets in the way because many of us have an idea of this is what sex is and isn't, or good sex is and isn't, or, and then also this is what is an okay way to practice spirituality or be connected to a religious organization. And I think because of those rules that we allow to, I guess, govern these aspects of our lives, it's really hard to, you were saying, go back to that reverence and awe, because you're, really kind of worried about, is this okay? Am I going to go to hell? Am I, all those questions. And it's not about how does this honor my authenticity? It's just really, you're not checking in with yourself anymore. You're kind of getting the okay or the authority from others.
Right. And what do we do when your sexual identity is far outside what used to be okay among most churches? What if you were gay or lesbian or trans or, polyamorous? Although that one kind of tricks me up. Let's just go on that soapbox for a hot second.
Okay.
Okay. Because biblically, right, even in the Quran and the Bible, there were we were fine with polygamy, but polyamory, I don't know, seems to blow most people's tops off. And that's something that I always wait. Even among,
right,
white Christian men, that was a thing, but we're good with putting that in historical context. And I'm not saying everyone should be polyamorous. I just get a little bit of a giggle going, wait, that's what blew your mind?
Right.
How many women did Solomon have? 700 wives and 300 concubines? That's one a day for 3.5 years. And I don't think he was sleeping with just one a day all the time, but
yeah,
that's,
And so since we are on that soapbox, okay.
I opened that Pandora's box.
Let's just go with it. And so for our listeners, what's the difference? What does it mean to be polygamous? What does it mean to be polyamorous?
So polygamy typically means that we have added a societal marriage arrangement or a commitment arrangement. So it's more of the sister wives that you've seen on TLC type thing.
Okay.
Whereas polyamory just means multiple love. And so that may include any form of non-monogamy depending upon the couple or triad, quadrad, whoever's playing. The arrangement can be different.
I suspect, just based on my observations, and that a lot of people are actually practicing polyamory, whether they want to admit it or not, or acknowledge it or not.
According to stats, it's over a third of us.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of people, y'all. And if you're at the club and you're flirting with someone and you don't tell your husband, or you guys have a don't ask, don't tell, you are practicing non-monogamy, friend. Just don't it.
Yeah. So again, another podcast topic.
Yeah. Stay tuned.
So I think, Tamara, you've really, shown the intersection between spirituality and God. I wanted to go back and ask you, because I know you've done, quite a lot of studying and research into this. What has stood out for you in your findings?
The sense of shame. Oh my God. Like, it makes everything worse. And I'm not saying this is tricky. Every time that we start to talk about spirituality, I always feel like I have to give a million disclaimers. I am all about spirituality. I'm all about Christianity. I'm all about Islam, whatever is important and sacred to you. However, when we start intersecting it with sex, these feelings of shame are what seems to cause the highest sense of distress and dysfunction. And what I hear from, it's typically not my client, but it's typically what my clients are afraid of, is they have heard all their lives that sense of shame is a good thing and keeps them on the right path. Well, you can imagine as a clinician how hard that becomes for me to help them move through something. It's never our job as a psychotherapist to tell them what the right path is for them, but to help them find a sense of wholeness and healing. And that's really hard to do if they are so full of shame that we can't approach most topics.
Yeah, and the shame is a really difficult part of all of this to move through. Very, very hard.
Right. And so I remember in undergrad, one of the first things that sparked my scholastic research was discovering this paper on Christian college men and masturbation that was done at Wheaton College, which is a Christian university that I grew up hearing about all the time. I actually had considered going there. So it struck my mind. I was like, oh, Wheaton College and masturbation, what? I'm not saying Wheaton College has a problem with masturbation. It turns out that their findings are very normative. Don't send me hate mail. But what struck me as interesting is the reason they found out that Christian college men had such a hard time with it was this sense of shame. And so what was interesting to me was that these Christian authors were proposing a more comprehensive sexual education to include, the development regarding the sex drive and desire, men producing sperm and the need to tend to want to get off once every 3 days. And so in that religion, telling them that they number one, cannot have sex till they can't get married. But number two, if they take, in my opinion, don't send me hate mail, the script on onanism, that's originally where white patriarchy in, puritanical days decided that masturbation was a sin. To me, they took that sacred text out of context. I would not necessarily tell clients they had to believe that, but I think putting it in historical context can be very empowering.
Yeah.
And in that story in the Bible, it was about a man who pulled out rather than following God's decree and impregnating I think it was his dead brother's wife. Y'all can look it up, but onanism. And so the point that these authors were making is that we have now been talking about this for 200 years without really explaining the historical context, without talking to these young men about how normal their bodies are to, be producing sperm and to be having hard-ons and to naturally be wanting to emit these things. That for them, what they noticed was that following the orgasm, their baseline was much lower as far as depressive symptoms, meaning it was worse than it was for non-Christian college men.
Very interesting. Just the connection to depression. And, if there was depression, there was also other things that they were struggling with, anxiety,
Mm-hmm. They always go hand in hand.
Yeah. So when you work with clients who maybe are having this disconnect between their sexuality and spirituality, how do you work with them?
I first really seek to honor their spiritual container first. I really seek to understand where they are coming from, because even if you have speaking to other therapists now, if you have other clients who come in that say that they're Christian, they're not all coming in with the same worldview. I promise you. If one is Southern Baptist, one is Pentecostal, and even within those denominations, some Pentecostals don't cut their hair or wear pants if they're female. And some are the types that will hold snakes and test their spirituality that way. They're very, very different. So for me, I have to build a very strong foundation. I'm phenomenological, which means I just want to understand the phenomenon going on in their head. Like, show me your worldview. That's my Tam's paraphrase of phenomenology.
But I mean,
so non-clinical.
But if you don't know that, you really, you're like just driving blind. You have to know what their worldview is.
I have to see how they're seeing things before I can find out how they're seeing how they get off.
Right.
Okay. That's key first. And then I always really stress normalization. I think it's important to now interject, like the authors of that article, normal sexual development. And then I usually apply some historical context. So in Christianity, in ancient Judaism, they were getting married by 13, 14. I mean, hell, that was almost middle age. And so when I say, absolutely, at that point, it was very important for these tribes to remain virgins until they got married because it was important to be able to prove paternity. That was survival to the family and the bloodline and the lineage.
Right.
But now fast forward 2,000, 5,000, 7,000 years and apply that same context and expect that these young men are going to make it all the way through college without having an orgasm is going to be tough. I don't take that away from them, but I want them to have a sense of relief of going, oh, thank God, it's not just me.
Right.
My body was meant to do this, even by a creationist standpoint.
Yeah. So if someone is listening right now, Tamara, and they're, maybe this is resonating with them and they're feeling that struggle between how they want to express and experience sexuality and, their spiritual part, what would you say to them?
That first, I promise you, God is big enough to handle these questions. The divine, whoever, Allah, whoever you conceptualize up there, Yahweh. Men and women have been wrestling with these questions for millennia. It is not a you problem. You are not pathological for having any of these thoughts, fantasies, issues, whatever it is that you are struggling with. But if it is causing you some pain or some concern, absolutely find someone both within your faith, I think is helpful to get some wisdom, but also someone outside of it, perhaps a therapist or a counselor or a coach or a mentor who can hold a different kind of space with you while you explore these things.
And do you have any resources that you would recommend for those who want to learn more about this?
No, I'm afraid, because it's as individual as the person.
Yeah, so really a process that they kind of have to embark on their own and see what calls to them.
Right, because there just aren't any, and that book would be huge if we were covering every worldview.
So really, almost like the instruction manual or the book that doesn't exist to address all of this is really a book you need to write for yourself.
Yes, and I think it's helpful to do that with someone else, like a therapist, not just plugging our business, but for me personally, I've always had a coach or a counselor. I think it's important, and I will also only see someone who also keeps one. So just like you would have a yoga instructor, a priest, and a dentist, I think having a coach or a counselor is helpful.
Tamara, what's the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you? And if you have anything that you'd like to share about any projects you're working on?
Sure. I am on the web at ariatherapy.com, ARYA, just like Arya Stark. It means not ordinary. I just couldn't pick a better name for my business.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, because I've been meaning to ask you, why you chose that. So thank you.
Yeah, it's perfect for this topic, because for me, it's a Sanskrit word. So I love that there's a pluralistic, multicultural flair to it. And it means not ordinary, noble, valuable, precious, and pure.
Oh, wow.
For me, that perfectly lines up not only with the way that I view my clients, each and every client, but also with a Bible verse. So it also honors my upbringing.
Yeah.
So it talks about only thinking about things that are noble, honorable, virtuous, and pure. So for me, it was a nod to both sides of me.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that.
So I am on the web at ariatherapy.com. We're also on Facebook at Aria Therapy Services. And then you mentioned my other fun project that does have a little more sparkly language and is a little pluralistic in nature, and that's Tales from a Trapezoid. It's a Facebook page and a private Facebook group. So would love to hear from any of the listeners.
And we'll make sure to put links in the show notes to all of the resources you mentioned. Tamara, thank you so much for coming on Women in Depth again. It was an absolute pleasure, and I again learned so much from you and feel really inspired, and I know that's also going to be the experience of our listeners.
Thank you for letting me get raw with you.
All right, take care, Tamara. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Tamara. One of the things that stood out for me is how Tamara described sexuality and spirituality as existing on two ends of a polarity, and that when an individual is able to align or integrate their sexuality and spirituality, then these areas thrive along with other areas of the person's life. And when a person is unable to reconcile or integrate their sexuality and spirituality, then one or both ends of the polarity will begin to atrophy, affecting the other end of the polarity and other areas of that person's life. Another part of the conversation that stood out for me was how shame can actually get in the way of a person really being able to experience an authentic and meaningful sexuality and spirituality. For show notes to today's episode, please visit www.lourdesviato.com/women-in-depth, where you will find show notes to today's episode along with links to Tamara's website and a link to her newly launched podcast, Undressing the Spirit. This is an incredible podcast where Tamara takes us on a no-holds-barred journey into the psyche and beyond. Tamara takes listeners behind the veil of counseling into erotic, relational, and spiritual diversity, uncovering how to accomplish mankind's greatest challenge, finding purpose and passion no matter the worldview or proclivity. So if you've enjoyed hearing Tamara on Women in Depth, I know you'll absolutely love her podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.